The fact that you're here this morning at this conference, I'm sure not much escapes you, so I'm confident that, excuse me, most of you have been aware of the recent television high point. Netflix brought back The Full House. Was everyone aware of that? Yeah, thanks for the applause. The new show is called The Fuller House, and among all the things that the existence of that show might say to us as a cultural touchstone, one message that is loud and clear, and it's hard to avoid, this is the message that's loud and clear, it's hard to avoid the gravitational pull of the 1980s. Netflix felt it, and so do I. My paper today is centered on the 1980s. I'm a child of the 80s, and so I'm conscious of the possibility that the 80s might loom large because of autobiography. I worry there just might be too much Punky Brewster in me. But I think there are good reasons, independent of that, to call our attention to the decade of the 1980s when we are considering Mormonism and American society and boundary maintenance. I'm interested in the way that public perception creates boundaries, hardens them, softens them, almost capriciously moves them, and I'm interested in trying to put public perception in historical context. And because of that interest, there are good reasons, I think, to see this past decade's contests over Mormonism's public image as a response to moves and moods of the 1980s. Of course, the moves and moods of the 1980s often were but a rehashing of suspicions and themes that would have been just as prevalent in the 1880s. We'll hear more of that later today, I'm sure. But it's worth considering the way that the 1980s gave those suspicions and themes a new life, new spins, new iterations, and in many ways set the terms by which modern Mormonism has worked to negotiate its place in American society. Image making is inherently a public process, and because of that it becomes a dialogue, sometimes a very heated public dialogue, over shades of emphasis and interpretation. But the very idea of image making can leave a sort of unpleasant aftertaste, especially if, as a cynic might say, it is equivalent to a public facade, or to institutional shape-shifting to fit current fashions. Now, to be sure, the LDS Church has been accused of such machinations, especially in the last few decades. However, the whole idea of public perception is more complicated than that, it seems. A new or renewed church emphasis on a particular tenet or practice that resonates widely in the church's host society, as a sociologist might say, does not necessarily equal inauthentic or simply convenient reinvention. There's simply no way around it. Latter-day Saints do care about the public's perception of their faith. This presents something of a paradox, because Mormons often self-identify as a peculiar people. To what degree, some might ask, should a peculiar people court public favor? Why then do Mormons even care? Well, simply put, because these peculiar people still want to talk to you. Mormonism aims to be a peculiar people that at the same time is not, in the apt word of President Gordon B. Hinckley, weird. This is not meant to oversimplify a host of psychological and cultural impulses that are certainly involved in the public perception puzzle, but this is meant to highlight an inherent tension in Mormonism as an evangelistic faith. Mormon elder Parley P. Pratt opened his 1837 pioneering missionary tract, The Voice of Warning, with a nod to public perception. Here's Parley P. Pratt. One of the greatest obstacles in the way of the spread of truth in every age is the tide of public opinion. Or as University of Richmond professor and prominent Mormon commentator Terrell Givens put it to filmmaker Helen Whitney, and here's where we draw the title of this presentation. You want to be mainstream enough that people will give your message a fair hearing. This becomes important from a Mormon standpoint when even recent polls show a persistent uncertainty rate well over 75% as to whether Mormons believe in Jesus Christ or the Bible. In our few minutes together, that's what I want to explore. The boundary of being mainstream enough that your message gets a fair hearing. We hear echoes of Quin Monson in this with optimum tension as he talks about the religion's place in a host society. And in that sense, the 1980s becomes a pivotal decade. There's so much that could be said, but I want to focus on three perceptions of the Mormons that gained unusual staying power in the 1980s, and then to talk about ways in which Mormons today still seem to be negotiating those currents. Here are those three images, those three impressions. Number one, Mormons as non-Christians. Two, Mormons as enforcers, and violently so, of institutional secrecy. And three, Mormons as bizarrely homogeneous. First, Mormons as non-Christians. It's worth repeating that this charge was nothing new in the 1980s. The Fundamentals series, the very series of publications in the 19-teens that gave rise to the term fundamentalist Christian, explicitly identified Mormons as, quote, thoroughly anti-Christian. So why look to the 1980s? Both because the 1980s represented something of a break from the trend of the previous few decades, and because something about the accusations of Mormonism's non-Christian status in the 1980s was new in terms of scope and tone. This change is brought into sharp relief by looking at the press coverage of presidential candidate and Mormon George Romney, Mitt Romney's father. By the time he ran for president in the 1968 campaign cycle, he had been president of American Motors, he'd been featured on the cover of Time magazine, and he was the popular three-term governor of Michigan. He was as well known of a Mormon nationally as any of his co-religionists. And yet when he ran for president, his Mormonism was essentially a non-issue. In fact, the nation called his Mormonism one of his political assets. Part of this was certainly due to the John F. As Randall Ballmer has aptly suggested. JFK's victory as a Roman Catholic did much to set the political tenor of the decade in terms of making religion something that seemed almost out of bounds in political contests. Plus, the religious mood of much of the country in the 1960s was one of ecumenism and cooperation. The spirit of Vatican II was in the air. This was also the time that retired managing director of LDS Church Public Affairs, Bruce Olson, called the golden era of Mormonism. Mormons were prominently on the rise. Ezra Taft Benson, J. Willard Marriott, Billy Casper were the faces of upstanding, family-friendly, sober. George Romney consistently pulled ahead of Lyndon Johnson in hypothetical polls. Romney seemed the very antithesis of Johnson, just as Mormons seemed the very antithesis of the upheaval of the 60s that haunted so many Americans. I think we heard some great comments from Ross Douthat on Monday night about this, about Mormons meeting the American consensus of the mood of the time. Here's what Jan Shipp said about the contrast. I am convinced that it was the dramatic discrepancy between clean-cut Mormons and scruffy that completed the transformation of the Mormon image from the quasi-foreign, somewhat alien likeness that it had in the 19th century to the more than 100% super-American portrait of the late 60s and early 70s. One case in point, George Romney's team conducted a dozen exploratory interviews nationwide, state by state, to assess local and regional feeling about a possible presidential campaign. Significantly, unexpectedly, reports on only 5 of those interviews out of more than 100 mention Romney's religion. And only 3 of those 5 expressed anything like concern over voters' potential hesitation because Romney was a Mormon. This is not to say, of course, that there were not groups opposed to Mormons on theological grounds at this time. Importantly, a book we've heard referenced in this conference already, Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults, was first published in 1965, right in the middle of this. It's just that the groups who were most opposed to Mormons on religious grounds, fundamentalist and evangelical Christians, were also farther removed from national platforms of public power than they would be in the 1980s, such that their opposition to Mormons did not broadcast widely. In other words, this era was pre-religious right. That significantly would change in the 1980s. The culture war issues that brought evangelical Christians roaring onto the political scene in the late 1970s gave born-again Christians new clout and new visibility. Newsweek magazine's designation of 1976 as the year of the evangelical is only one case in point, as our polls suggest that organizers like Jerry Falwell registered 4 million new evangelical and fundamentalist Christian voters. And many assumed that these Christians' emphasis on social conservatism would make them ready political allies with Latter-day Saints, who had also achieved some prominence at the same time with their opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment and that amendment's perceived threat to traditional families. However, those who foresaw a Mormon evangelical alliance did not take into account just how deeply evangelicals feared Mormon heterodoxy. New evangelical prominence on the one hand, coupled with Mormon growth in the traditional U.S. Bible Belt, like announced temples in Dallas and Atlanta, set the stage for what Newsweek called a turf war. It's also worth noting in this conference on boundary maintenance that Jan Shipp has made a really intriguing argument that evangelicals used Mormons as a foil, a theological other, by which to define their boundaries, because it was a loose coalition that it was easier to define who they were by what they were not, and Mormons served that role. To many concerned Christians, this was more than sheep stealing and church memberships numbers. To them, the Mormon threat centered on a common Christian worry that because Mormons purportedly believed in the wrong Jesus, Mormon proselytizing was actually antithetical to Christian evangelism. Perhaps nothing symbolizes how fraught the tensions were in the 1980s than the God-makers. No previous anti-Mormon campaign had carried as far and as wide as the God-makers. The film's production team was led by Ed Decker, a former Mormon whose group Saints Alive in Jesus had an expressed aim to convert Mormons, but found its largest audience among evangelical Christian congregations. By late 1983, the movie was being shown to 1,000 audiences a month. Perhaps 250,000 viewers a month were seeing the film. The film depicted LDS theology as having pagan and even occult and satanic traditions. It reinforced for many viewers concerns about the potentially soul-destroying effects of Mormon proselytizing, and this is what made it new. New VCR technology made distribution possible on a new scale, and the movie seemed to speak to a question that plagued many Christians. How could my kind Mormon neighbors be part of a counterfeit satanic cult? The God-makers provided plausibility. Mormons themselves were deceived. That's how carefully woven the Mormon facade was, and that's why the faith spread was so diabolical. The God-makers represented something new in anti-Mormon polemics. It went further than simply repeating that Mormons were not Christians, a charge that Mormons were well accustomed to by the 1980s. Instead of depicting Mormonism as a religion that had strayed from the Christian fold, the God-makers suggested something more sinister, something based less on Mormon confusion and more on Mormon cunning. Mormonism was not just a heresy, it was a counterfeit. It might be worth taking a pause right here to say that as we try to trace the Mormon image, I think this is more impressionistic. It's about as scientific, perhaps, as the pain scale at the doctor's office when they ask you what level you're at. So I don't claim any precision to this. But what I do want to represent is a sense of what's happening. And so we have two trend lines that are just simply representing impressionistic sort of gathering of all bits of evidence. But the thickness of the line is meant to represent the degree or the emphasis on which media coverage, other things seem to place the most attention on. So as you can see, at this time of the golden era of Mormonism, there was a feeling that Mormons individuals, green line, and the Mormon institution, blue line, were held in fairly high public esteem. But most of the attention in media features was devoted to Mormon individuals. This precipitous drop that we're going to talk about in the 1980s, it seems one of the changes was that most attention was devoted to the Mormon institution. But the other thing that seems telling, and this is a 1980s story, is this split, this reporting split, where Americans could hold one opinion of Mormon individuals and another opinion of Mormon institutions, and that dichotomy is a 1980s story. And it plays really well into the second impression of the 1980s, and that's Mormonism's sinister secrecy. As widely as the God-makers played, the movie and its message largely stayed at the level of the conservative Christian subculture, which was still a huge subculture. Outside of evangelical Christian circles, though, the movie did not make much of a splash in terms of national media attention. All of that changed, though, when a string of internal controversies rocked Mormonism in the 1980s and early 1990s. For 5 years, from 1980 to 1985, Mormon documents dealer Mark Hoffman made headlines for spectacular finds that challenged the LDS traditionalist narratives about its founder, Joseph Smith. When Hoffman killed 2 people with bombs 30 years ago this past October, his operation unraveled. His finds had been forgeries. The crimes brought reporters in droves to Salt Lake, and sensationalism often trumped accuracy when news stories simply reported that Mormons who had dealt in controversial historical documents had been murdered. The sheer volume and placement of reporting about Mark Hoffman across the nation gave this story a prominence of wholly different proportions. The headline volume in major journalism venues was 40 times that devoted to other recent Mormon stories like the God-makers. The 1980s also saw various blood feuds among fundamental polygamist families, extremists that the public considered Mormons despite the church's disavowals. And if we think of the decade as the long 80s, this perception of institutional control could be bookmarked by the excommunication of Sonia Johnson on the one end and the excommunication of the September 6 in 1993 on the other. Reporters from across the country descended on Salt Lake City to pick up all of these stories, and hundreds of media pieces through the decade repeated words like empire or notoriously secretive or shadowy to describe the LDS Church. These stories repeatedly reinforced the God-makers' unsettled Mormonism, such that there seemed to be ample evidence for church critics that the friendly Mormon facade was neither flawless nor factual, and that its outwardly happy believers had been largely duped by an ominous organization. This third image is closely related, and that is of homogeneous, in the worst sense, as conformist, unthinking clones. One irony of timing is the 1980s also saw some high points in terms of Mormon human interest stories. I always have to bring in BYU sports in any presentation, and 1984 was the year the BYU football team won an improbable national championship. Sports Illustrated featured photos and stories of returned missionaries. Charlene Wells, the daughter of a church general authority, was named Miss America. Yet even in the coverage of these celebrity Mormons and these high points in terms of Mormon publicity, there lingered an inescapable sense of pervasive institutional control. They called Mormons clones, an army of do-rights. Rolling Stone magazine, for example, hit hard. This is their quote: drinking, smoking, premarital sex, they're all taboo at Brigham Young University, the nation's largest private college, where obedience, not thought, is rewarded, and snitches are big men on campus. Good Mormon America. Here's a similar sense in the report of a pro-ERA delegate at the Washington International Women's Year Convention, describing in The Humanist her displeasure at seeing, quote, Mormon women wearing long gowns and Stepford wife expressions clustered around their men, waiting for signals on how to vote. As Mormon faces popped up in every arena of American life, more than ever, their prominence did not erase public discomfort about the church that guided those smiling men and women. What we're suggesting here is that the mid-'80s can be seen as an important turning point, and perhaps the important turning point, at least in the last half century, in the trajectory of American public opinion of Mormonism. In 1977, 54% of Americans responded to Gallup that they rated Mormons on the favorable side of a numeric scale, a favorability high point for years to come. 14 years later, in a 1991 study by Barna Group, half that many, 27%, saw Mormons favorably. Even taking into account differences in reporting criteria, the wording of questions, even organizational bias, the drop is nevertheless telling, and maybe even starker. In that 1991 study, just 6% of Americans viewed Mormons very favorably. 3 times as many respondents had given Mormons that rating only 14 years earlier. These overlapping controversies in the 1980s become the 1, 2, 3 punches that left the Mormon image measurably bruised. So for our purposes today, and from a Mormon standpoint, thinking back to Terrell Givens, these lingering impressions about Mormons threw barriers in a way of a fair hearing for Mormonism's message. And their persistent relevance in the discussion about Mormonism, public perception of Mormons, became clear during Mitt Romney's presidential campaigns. That was something that surprised many Mormons. And considering the Rust Belt in the 1980s, it's fair to ask how any Mormon could have been surprised by the religious, or at least religiously related, opposition to Mitt Romney's candidacy. The surprise, I think, speaks to how different things felt in the decade-plus administration of LDS Church President Gordon B. Hinckley. Immediately upon assuming the church's presidency, Hinckley signaled a drop in defensiveness, a leaving the bunker mentality. We'll move forward. He appears on Mike Wallace. He appears on Larry King. We can just tick through other things that happened. The church changes its logo to emphasize the preeminence of Jesus Christ. The Olympics come, and President Hinckley wins a lot of public support for the decision not to proselytize. There he is pictured with Tom Brokaw. And the church made some strides in public polling and correcting some misconceptions. A Washington Post columnist wrote, "The subtle approach in the end was a brilliant move by the church. The only religious shenanigans and Bible thumping at the Winter Games came courtesy of angry other denominations whose members circled Temple Square with anti-Mormon signs and pamphlets and posters. Everyone looked nutty except the Mormons, who looked golden." I think that's what contributed to the surprise that many Latter-day Saints felt when Mitt Romney faced so much religiously based opposition. I think we see that the 1980s type suspicions of Mormons and Mormonism had not dissipated, they were only dormant. All 3 of these impressions were projected onto Romney. We might think of well-timed "Jesus and Satan are brothers" comments, of "a vote for Romney is a vote for Satan" web campaigns, of Romney's description as a flip-flopper as being reflective of an inauthenticity or facade mentality that was somehow seen as endemic to Mormonism. Thankfully, and I say that especially from the standpoint of providing us the opportunity to look at such an interesting and immediate case study of potential change over time, Mitt Romney ran a second time. This became a windfall for those who are interested in comparative studies, and there seems to be broad agreement that 2012 felt much different than 2008. I appreciate Quin Monson's and David Campbell's presentation yesterday about their assertions about the political negative impact of Mormonism on Mitt Romney in 2008 that was not detectable in 2012. And I'm interested in just the last few minutes in ticking through a few other things that seem to be evidence that public perception on these 1980s impressions may be shifting. And I say that in the spirit of someone tracking the progress of a polar expedition. The complicating factor is that the expedition moves, but so does the ice. I think that's why public perception is such a moving target. Sometimes the ground moves beneath you. Sometimes what appears to be moving in a desirable direction meets the reality of reversal thanks to unexpected currents. So let's just tick through a couple. Speaking to the non-Christian cult perception recently. And I also think it's worth noting the way the Mormon institution itself might be having some recent image rehabilitation. October 2011, Pastor Jeffress from Dallas, introducing Rick Perry, calls Mormonism a cult. Joanna Brooks, I think, rightly observed this is a moment when things seem to change, the tone seemed to change. First of all, CNN's Anderson Cooper would not let that assertion go unchallenged on CNN. And then in the weekend immediately following that accusation, Rich Mao, president of Fuller Seminary, published a CNN.com editorial, "My Take, Mormons Are Not a Cult." Billy Graham's Evangelistic Association dropped from their website descriptions of Mormonism as cult. Franklin Graham asserts, there's Rich Mao, that Mormons and Christians share values that are biblically based. I always appreciate expressions of surprise, too, as indicating a healthy corrective to public misperception. I think all of us can sense that in ourselves when we learn something about a group or a person that challenges our assumptions, we say, wow, I didn't know that. One hears that surprise, for example, in a First Things article by Roman Catholic philosopher who recently passed away, Stephen Webb, who wrote, "Mormons are obsessed with Christ," when he talked about his surprise when he read the Book of Mormon. Significantly, 2 years later, Webb published a book with Oxford University Press called Mormon Christianity, What Other Christians Can Learn from the Latter-day Saints. Let's just skip ahead to one other thing that might be about the ground moving. Another interesting trend in 2012, considering the voter outcome, was this call that perhaps 2012 marked the end of evangelical Christians as kingmakers in the Republican Party. I think that is interesting to think about, the way the ground has shifted. And it may be that as evangelical Protestants' political clout seems to be diminishing, their cultural power as gatekeepers of the term Christian might also be less and less important. This seems meaningful for groups like the Latter-day Saints who want to self-identify as Christians to clear up uncertainties about whether or not they believe in the Bible or Jesus Christ. Pew's discovery that even a 4-point shift among evangelical Protestants, or a 14-point shift in 2012 over people who felt, Christians who felt that Mormonism religion was not as radically different from theirs, seems significant. Speaking to impression of the enforced institutional secrecy, 2 bits of evidence to consider. One, I think in 2012, the media's willingness to turn to authentic Mormon voices, a new sense that Mormon commentators could be trusted and that journalists could still get a straight story. Some of those voices are in this room today. This seemed to be a noticeable change. I'm also interested in how things felt different today than they did 30 years ago in the world of Mormon history. We've already heard in this conference from Mike Otterson and Maxine Hanks about the expansion of the Joseph Smith Papers and the Gospel Topics essay. It's worth noting the attention, and again the sense of surprise, in national media outlets about increasing institutional transparency in Mormonism. I think we can't miss that the November 2014 New York Times article about a Gospel Topics essay on LDS polygamy used the word transparent 4 times and the word open 2 times in this one article. One other related change that should not be missed here is the growing outside academic attention to Mormonism. This is telling, I think. One more thing should be said about the Gospel Topics essays. This last year, the LDS Church launched a new required institute class for college-age LDS students, and BYU launched a corresponding required course. The course is called Foundations of the Restoration, and the required reading in the course is the Gospel Topics essays. Finally, speaking to the impression of a disturbing, clonish, Stepford wife-like homogeneity in Mormonism, Matthew Bowman told National Public Radio that in his view, Mitt Romney's 2012 run had, quote, done a fair amount to refute the great myth of Mormonism that it's a monolith. The irony, as Bowman noted, is that Mitt Romney seemed the very picture of what the public might imagine when they think of as a Mormon. But this was the I'm a Mormon campaign. Interestingly, I was struck by a letter to the editor of the Salt Lake Tribune from a Mormon in Salt Lake who challenged the I'm a Mormon campaign when it was first launched by saying that the Mormons in the spots didn't look like the members of her Salt Lake Valley ward. Responses came in from across the U.S. to say that these faces did look like the faces in their Mormon wards in places like Baltimore or Atlanta or Boston. Jabari Parker's place on the cover of Sports Illustrated is one more strike against the perception of Mormon homogeneity. And in terms of reported surprise, how about this from the Washington Post? Utah passes landmark LGBT bill. Now some complicating thoughts to end. Newsweek asked historian Jan Ships that the fact that Mormon rhetoric was becoming more overtly evangelical signaled that the Mormons were going mainstream. Not at all, was how she responded. After a century of cultivating their separate identity as a religious people, Mormons now want to stress their affinities with traditional Christianity, yet highlight their uniqueness. She also told in Time, at the time of President Ezra Taft Benson's death, that the church was, quote, steering a middle course. What I think will be interesting moving into the future is how well the LDS Church as an institution will be able to navigate a middle course, what we heard Michael Otterson talking about, to avoid, as he said yesterday, being shoehorned into assumed categories, but instead continually creating surprises for people who perceived one thing but discover another. On immigration, for example, on refugees, on the increasingly complex issue of LGBT rights. In terms of religious plurality, I'm all for heading in the direction of substantive conversations instead of sound bites, for fair hearings instead of assumptions. Thank you.
Well, I'm very pleased to be able to offer some reactions to J.B. Haws's remarks, which I found wonderful. So thank you, J.B. That was very well done. I think I want to, what I'll do is just offer a couple of comments that touch on some themes that J.B. brought up in ways that touch on my own work and also raise questions for me in terms of just things I'd like to talk about, maybe things we can talk about as we get to the Q&A portion, or things that we can talk about further later. But I thought that one of the most interesting things that you brought up was of course I'm going to say this because this is, when you look at my work, it's just full of data. So when you brought up a slide with Mormon image data over time, and the comparison of the 77 Gallup poll with the 1991 Barna poll, I am fascinated by that, and I want some help understanding the data and the figure better, to know where it comes from and how it's constructed. It looks like it's content analysis of media, or
those were both national surveys of respondents.
No, but the over time. Okay.
I would say it's mostly content analysis.
Yeah, because I found, what I really found interesting, and I think is really worth exploring in the future in your work or in other work, is this idea of perceptions of Mormons as individuals being different from perceptions of the church as an institution. That's a really fascinating idea, and one that I've heard before in a different context. So if you study, in political science, if you study the United States Congress, any undergraduate course worth its salt will bring up what's come to be known as Fenno's paradox, and it refers to a political scientist named Richard Fenno, the University of Rochester, who noticed a long time ago that our attitudes about our own individual member of Congress are very, very different from our attitudes about Congress itself. And that in turn is different from our attitude about Congress as an institution, right? So we love our member of Congress for the most part because we elect people who generally, I mean, this is a generalization. I mean, members of Congress get reelected because they look like their districts, right? They represent the demographics of districts reasonably well. So most members of Congress enjoy pretty good favorability ratings, and most of them, the vast majority of them, get reelected, right? And yet, the collection of members of Congress as a whole is viewed extremely unfavorably, right? Especially right now, we've seen historic lows in the last few years. On the other hand, Congress as an institution, if you frame it that way, people start to think of the Constitution and sort of something that they, our democratic system, and then that image is still okay. And so you're making some distinctions that I think are worth noting, and I think makes sense in the context of my own work with David Campbell and John Green, where we use some theories from sociology and psychology to show that when people have close friends and family who are Latter-day Saints, they are resistant to negative information about Mormons, right? In the context, we use Mitt Romney and his 2008 campaign as the context for our data collection. But when people are only a little bit familiar, right, that actually causes a worse reaction. So it's a little odd it's as if you know somebody at the office who is LDS, but you don't know him well, and all you know about him is that he is a little strange, right? This weirdness factor. He won't go for drinks after, he doesn't want to hang, he doesn't want to do some of the stuff that the guys at the office want to do. And so you sort of think, well, he's strange and I don't like him. But then if you actually spent years, getting to know him, and you realize, well, there's some strange things, but he's kind of endearing. I kind of, he's a real nice guy, that kind of a thing. And then you find yourself defending him when people say stuff about him, right? That's the kind of thing that I think we find, and the kind of thing that you're getting at here with this individual versus institutional difference. And I do like that. If you can nail down what those data actually represent and convince me that it's really systematic, I think that's a fantastic step forward in understanding attitudes about Mormons over time. Because whenever you show that kind of change and that gap that you show growing, there's something to be explained there, and that's really interesting. I want to come back to this idea that is pervasive in this conference, I think, about and you pulled out some quotes that illustrate it well. The one from Terrell Gibbons, mainstream enough, right? The idea that Mormons want to be should be a peculiar people, but also court public favor at the same time. It's this paradox, right? Mormons want to be and are distinctive, both within the Christian tradition and compared to the rest of American society. It's this two-front war that we talk about in our work. But they want and need some degree of acceptance. And I wanted to just float some ideas that occurred to me as you were presenting and I was reading your remarks about how that plays out in 2016 is in terms of where I see it happening the most. This paradox between being distinctive and different and yet wanting and needing some degree of acceptance. One of them is in the realm of religious freedom and religious tolerance that the church has put so much emphasis on in recent years, and so needing acceptance is important because it is what legitimizes the church's arguments about religious freedom, right? Mainstream enough that people give your message a fair hearing. If the church is not accepted in terms of its approach, then those arguments about religious freedom will be rejected. And that is, in some ways, I think, if you read this, the speeches and talks of Elder Dallin Oaks and others, it feels like they've put that religious freedom argument up as some sort of last bulwark. And that brings me to my next point, which is, in the debate over LGBT rights and marriage and traditional marriage, there seems to be, if you read the statements of church leaders, that they've sort of resigned themselves to having lost that. The Supreme Court decided, we'll move on. If you're a clerk and a county clerk somewhere, you need to obey the law. That kind of an approach, right? But at the same time, they are holding to the traditional marriage doctrine, right? And in my view, occupying kind of a no man's land where they're not trusted by anyone fully, because what the church is doing is staying true to their traditional marriage doctrine within the church, and yet trying to be accommodating where possible. So you have this, hard work to get an anti-discrimination law statewide in Utah. I think the church was integral to that, and before that to get one in Salt Lake City, and making public statements that are accommodating in the sense of we should be kind and nice and not and even though we're holding firm on our doctrine, we're there's this, effort to be as accommodating as possible, and yet that doesn't make anyone else happy, right? You can't fully satisfy the proponents of LGBT rights because they're not quite going far enough, and yet the religious conservative opponents to gay marriage are much more hard-nosed in their approach, and so it's an interesting position to be in because it leaves them out alone, basically. It leaves the church out alone. And I think then the other way that this plays out in 2016 is a way that it's always played out. The church sees a need to be distinctive and yet have some degree of acceptance because it affects its core religious mission, which one of those is missionary work. And that's always been true, right? But you can't appeal to people with a gospel sort of conversion message if that message isn't distinctive, and yet you can't appeal to them if your message is anathema to, everything else that's going on in the broader society. And so there, again, is this fine line to walk of being appealing and yet not too distinctive. And I'll leave it there and turn it over to David, and then we'll talk more.
The shortest guy in the room. So I really enjoyed that presentation, and I teach a class here called Mormon Cultural Studies, and what ends up playing out in the course by the end is the idea that of tension that arises within both within Mormonism and between Mormonism and the rest of society. And I begin my lecture series by asking students, what does it mean to be Mormon? What is Mormon? And quickly everyone says, well, it means you belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then I say, okay, does that mean Christian? What about Community of Christ? Or Community of Christ members Mormons? What about the FLDS Church? Are they Mormons? And of course, the discussion starts getting more convoluted and argumentative, and students start to realize that identity, right, can be both political, right, and can also sometimes be like trying to attach Jell-O to the wall. It's not quite as simple as sometimes we think it is when we give it more thought. The first paper that I actually did, my master's thesis actually was had followed. I don't know if you remember this, but Dan Quayle, when he was running for president, or I guess this was during the primaries. I was pretty young back then. I try not to remember much of the '80s. I mean, it brought us Ronald Reagan and Howard Jones. So. And Pee Wee Herman. Now I just lost my train of thought. Pee Wee Herman does that to me. Where was I? Dan Quayle, thank you. So Dan Quayle, when he was running for president, in an attempt to appeal to evangelicals, he made a comment critical of a television character who had had a baby outside of wedlock. And I'm trying to remember her name. Murphy Brown, thank you. And he criticized Murphy Brown, thinking this would get him the evangelical vote. And instead, everyone turned on him. They got really upset about this. And what this demonstrated was that even among evangelicals, who people thought had expressed these very similar sheepish-like values where they all kind of followed the rules, that there was actually they weren't as homogeneous as we thought, that there was some diversity within that group. And so following up on that, I thought, well, gee, Maybe the same holds true for Latter-day Saints. When there's a popular cultural reference like Murphy Brown, someone that they really are attached to, maybe their religiosity somehow plays a different role under those circumstances than when they, are voting for, different politicians. And so I did my study, my master's thesis on BYU students and video watching behavior, which was really fun to do. And I did survey research, quantitative analysis, and discovered, quite unsurprisingly, that even amongst people at Brigham Young University, a conservative, institutional, hardcore school run by the church with this BYU honor code, that there was a diversity of opinions and beliefs and practices regarding media and entertainment and their attachment to various edicts of church leaders in terms of things like R ratings, Schindler's List, violence, nudity, and so on. And I think that what that shows is that even within Mormonism, there's this tension in terms of what does it mean, right, to be LDS. And so Latter-day Saints are quick to defend the name of the church and themselves as a group, and yet they come to the group itself with different, not necessarily orthodox opinions, but more heterodoxical opinions, right? And to me, the irony of the struggle for the mainstream church to be seen as mainstream in many ways, or Christian and similar, and to reach across religious and denominational borders. On the one hand, that decreases the critique or criticism of institutional religion, right? I think Americans and American culture is very individualistic and very much about individual rights. And the literature shows that people are unlikely to attack people based on their personal religious beliefs. I think this is why Mitt Romney was defended so vociferously when he was really close to becoming, a real viable candidate for president. Because it's just not cool to attack people's personal religiosity. However, institutions are still suspect in America. They're suspect by Americans in general who are concerned about hypocrisy or abuse of power, and certainly news organizations are concerned about of those things as well, and corruption, right? And so we have the church now that has tried in bypassing that 80s problem, trying to kind of reposition itself in two ways that we've already learned about today now. One is through this new transparency, right? Putting stuff up online now that people have been discovering, and now the church is backing it up and putting their stamp on it. But the other thing is the I'm a Mormon campaign. And my question about that, what I'm wondering about the I'm a Mormon campaign, I just had my students do an assignment on that, where they had to look at a handful of those short videos and determine what they learned about Mormonism based on that experience, right? And for those students, what they discovered, which is what I found, is that those individuals on that website, you could watch the entire thing, and until they say I'm a Mormon, you would have no idea they have any attachment to the LDS institution, right? It's completely focusing and centering on personal, private spirituality and religiosity versus the public face of the church or the institutional church. And so in many ways what that is doing is diffusing this idea of a gap between Mormons and other people, right? Mormons are normal. We're just like everybody else. But on the other hand, it is making it difficult for the institution now, perhaps, to demarcate itself from other religious organizations. And so the question is, getting back to Terrell Gibbons' point, the question of being, what was the word? What was the phrase? Mainstream enough to be listened to, right? The challenge, I think, that faces the church and individuals in the church today now is for the church itself to not be so mainstream as to lose its identity, right? And I think part of that is what is behind, I think, the church's more vocal stand on LGBT issues lately. I think they're retrenching to use Moss's word on that subject, on that issue. But at the same time, they're trying to be more kind of egalitarian and universal and accepted. And I think that is a battle that has yet to be won on either side. Thanks.
So as a child of the 80s, we were always told that the Godmakers was the anti-Mormon thing that you had to stay away from. I would say given that and kind of Mark Hoffman and all of that kind of coalescing at the same time, do you think that that had an effect on internal boundary making for the Mormon Church and maybe keeping people from asking questions and exploring, I would say, the kind of things that are now coming out in terms of transparency? Because my experience was that was definitely the case, and I think that my generation definitely had that experience, but I don't know about generations previous to me.
Really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think we could see a couple of different impulses. I think one that you described is probably right. I think there were signals that the dismantling of Leonard Arrington's history division in the church history headquarters, some discomfort that sort of swirled around Mark Hoffman, this idea of history as potentially dangerous, as maybe off limits. I think that probably did suppress some of those feelings. I think maybe the Godmakers in the same way, that there was a fear factor attached to some of the really really widely distributed anti-Mormon campaigns. But I also think, interestingly, we could also see some of the trends in Latter-day Saint scholarship as responding to those impulses. So it probably went both ways. So that the Godmakers launched a new approach to Latter-day Saint Christian apologetics, which morphed into, I think, the LDS Evangelical Dialogue, which has borne some remarkable fruit in terms of open conversations, and maybe also fueled a number of remarkable people to look at history in new ways. I think we need to acknowledge, for example, Rick Turley, who wrote the book Victims in 1992 about the Mark Hoffman saga, and received really impressive open support from the church as a church employee to do that. And I think he himself also cultivated a lot of trust to lead to some more historical openness. So I think both impulses probably affected the Mormon culture, the Mormon community.
I'll add to that, just as you're talking, it occurred to me that maybe that distinction between institution and individuals plays into that. So the institutional reaction is retrenchment and a siege mentality where you're being attacked, but it sparks something in individual members, scholars, others, where they're taking a new direction, and it leads to institutional adjustment later, right? So part of the adjustment by the institution now is a response to individuals leading out in a particular direction.
Yeah, I think an endorsement and an adoption of some of these approaches.
And the very things on the LDS topics pages are things that were put forward by scholars, years before, right? Those are now being sort of co-opted and institutionalized in many ways.
Yeah, well said.
Okay, let's take one more question down here.
My wife and I raised our 5 kids outside of Utah for 3.5 decades, and very active Mormons in weird situations. We overcame a lot of prejudice and attacks with our sense of humor. And other members of the church in little branches here and there around the country did the same. We developed over those 3.5 decades a very friendly sense of humor. Has that ever been studied? I think Mormons have a terrific sense of humor and irony.
Maybe that's another institutional individual distinction, because I don't know that the institution often doesn't react with a sense of humor while individuals do, right? So that may be a way to explore that. right? And again, it's a level of seriousness that the church as an institution takes with everything that it does, right? That it you know, it's when you see a joke in general conference, it's surprising, right? That's what makes it even more funny, because it's so out of context, I guess.
I can say, maybe with one exception, and that is when the Book of Mormon play was released in New York City, and the church ran ads in the playbill that said, "Right, the book is always better than the play or the movie." I thought that was pretty good. I was impressed by that, rather than becoming, and to me that was a shift. Rather than being reactionary and going on the defense, they just put the ad out there, had the ads running on Times Square, and just kind of let it go. And I think that was the smart thing to do. I think maybe they've learned some lessons from local members.
Yeah, I think those are great examples. I think Gordon Hinckley is one who showed how disarming humor could be. And then I also would say Meet the Mormons, the way Meet the Mormons starts including clips, unexpected clips from sitcoms, from South Park. I mean, I think that is a nod that there maybe is some of what Quinn is talking about, of institutional adopting some of this. And maybe along these lines, in your experience, I think there's something that I didn't say in the paper, but I had in the paper, but Quinn, he mentioned this research that he and John Green and David Campbell did. In USA Today in 2009, this study was really ingenious that they talked about, because they didn't just ask people, if you knew a lot about Mormons. They didn't stop there. They administered a quiz to find out if people really did know a lot about Mormons based on what they said. And I think that's the significant, that point should not be missed, what he said, that those who really did, by proof of the quiz, know a fair amount about Mormons, were not affected by the negative perceptions. And so I think it's worth just leaving with, echoing in our minds something that David and Quinn said yesterday, and that is that the difference between bonding and bridging and for minority religious groups, and I think this is a big story of moving forward, is are Mormons going to bridge or going to bond? And your personal example, I think, is worth saying that.
And you can do both.
Right. Well said.
JB, David, Quinn, thank you very much for being with us this morning. Please join me in thanking them.